New Thinking Aloud is presented by the California Institute for Human Science, Mind, Body, Spirit University, a leader in fully accredited in-person and online U.S. college degree programs in the topics we cover here. Visit their website at cihs.edu.
Thinking Aloud. Conversations on the leading edge of knowledge and discovery with psychologist Jeffrey Mishlove.
Hello and welcome. I'm Jeffrey Mishlove. Today we're going to look at how precognition works. With me is Dr. Ed May, who is the former director of the military intelligence psychic spying program known as Project Stargate. In addition, he is the author or co-author of ESP Wars, East and West, and co-author of Anomalous Cognition, Remote Viewing Research and Theory. He is also co-editor of a 2-volume set of academic papers called Extrasensory Perception, Support, Skepticism, and Science. Ed is an experimental physicist. Welcome, Ed.
Thank you, Jeffrey. It's a pleasure to be here.
It's a pleasure to be with you, too. Precognition is a subject that causes people to get headaches.
Yes.
Sometimes it seems to be full of paradoxes, and yet, as we have talked about on this program before, there's a wealth of empirical evidence supporting the reality of precognition.
Yes.
And what we're going to look at now is how can we begin to model it?
Or, better question, how does precognition actually work?
Yeah.
That's a real tough question. And I don't mean this in a flippant answer, but the 3 most important words in science are, I don't know. Given I've said that, we have some ideas about how to move forward with it. The best way to think about it, how can you see the sunset while you're sitting on the beach in Hawaii? How does that work? You know, I'm pretty lazy as a physicist. What we'd like to do is see by analogy what can we use for things that we think we understand and import it into a new model.
Well, we do know a lot about conventional sensory mechanisms.
Exactly. So you're sitting on the beach. What happens? The sun is going into the Pacific. It's really beautiful. And what is the sun doing? It's signaling to you. And how does it do that? It sends photons to you. It takes about 8 minutes for them to travel from the sun to here.
Yeah.
It hits your retina. The retina has a fiber nerve, the optic nerve that goes all the way to the back of your head. And even then, at that moment, a tenth of a second later, you don't know you've seen anything. But a quarter of a second later, voila, you see the sunset. How that actually happens in the head, there's a technical name called visual binding. But don't worry, it's a very tough problem.
Yeah.
Okay, so how would ESP work or precognition work? By analogy. Well, there's something that's signaling from the future. How that happens is a real tough problem. We'll get to it in a minute. Let's just assume that you have in your head, for lack of a better term, a psychic retina. And so that psychic photon, if you will, hits your psychic retina, and it gets absorbed in the brain like a real photon does, and voila, you have an experience which we call precognition. Well, that's a rough analogy. Let's look more details.
Okay.
We have no idea what would constitute a psychic retina.
It's important to get that out.
Yeah, that's a big one. That's a real one.
There may not be. People have attempted to find organs of psychic perception.
They have indeed, and guess what? They haven't worked yet.
No. So it might be the whole nervous system.
It might be. Even there were some ideas in Russia from the 67 that the whole body is the psychic retina, if you will.
I'm inclined to think that the body as a whole functions as a psychic antenna.
Well, that would be nice if it did. So I'm going to start at the one end of the antenna, if you will, looking at the brain.
Yeah.
All right. So when you're trying to figure out how precognition might work, the first thing one has to do when you're a theorist is to say, what do the data tell us what's going on? Okay, here are a bunch of things that the data tell us. Number one is not everybody is a Joe McMoneagle super psychic. On the other hand, everybody has some psychic ability, so the model has to be able to screen out most people and look for the good guys. That's one. The second thing is what things that are known about neuroscience that could accomplish that screening for us.
Okay.
So the first one we are guessing at is a hypothesis that the normal visual systems, like let's say your eyes, some people can see far, some into the infrared and some into the ultraviolet, others cannot. We are positing as a hypothesis that the people who are in the tails of that distribution, who can see a little bit more in the ultraviolet, are going to be better at this. But how do we connect that sensory system into our putative transducer or psychic retina?
Well, before we get there, let me ask you, why would you make that hypothesis?
It's part of winnowing down or slimming down the population because everybody fits in this kind of bell-shaped curve. We're going to look at the guys at the ends.
But there are a lot of things you could look at.
Absolutely.
For example, I have all my life had what I call telescopic vision.
Okay.
I can see things at a great distance and see them quite clearly and distinctly. Read license plate numbers from maybe a block away.
Remind me not to rob a bank in front of you, okay?
Well, why wouldn't you look for that instead of the ultraviolet and infrared ranges?
Because those kinds of things that you just described, but there are many others you could have described. The one you did is more in the optic system in your eyeball, how your lenses work, rather than what the neuroscience is going.
Okay.
It's how the data gets into your head.
Yeah.
Okay, so, all right, let's assume that we have some knowledge, which we don't, about the psychic retina. We have to connect whatever that psychic retina is to the rest of the brain.
Yeah.
And so we need some sort of hyperconnectivity to connect that to the rest of the brain. Some connections between whatever those neurons, whatever they turn out to be, can be connected to the rest of the brain.
Well, when you say the rest of the brain, that implies that the psychic retina, as you call it, is distinct from the brain itself.
Well, that is an empirical question. We're assuming that it is.
Okay.
And that kind of connection is similar to, by analogy, synesthesia. For example, your visual system gets intertwined with your audio system. You can hear sound, hear letters. You can see letters in color and so on. Okay.
Let's not go over that so quickly. Because synesthesia is very important here. You are hypothesizing, as I understand it, that people who are good at synesthesia are probably good at other kinds of parapsychological functioning.
That is a hypothesis, because we need to have some way in the brain to connect this transducer, if it is like a small thing, to the rest of the brain, and that's a form of sensory input, like the vision system, and it has to connect to the rest of the brain.
And so what you're saying, if I understand you correctly, is let's define it once again so that people get that clearly. People who have synesthesia typically are people who may hear colors or they may see sounds.
Right.
For example, they take the input from one sensory modality and it gets displayed in their, what we call their sensorium, is in a different modality.
Exactly. And the brain is interconnected in very strange ways to allow that to happen.
That's what we call
hyperconnectivity.
Hyperconnectivity, and that's what you're looking for.
Exactly.
Okay.
Now, one other nice feature of guessing that, or performing a hypothesis that people that have synesthesia, they're called synesthets, only about 4% of the population have that experience. So that's another way of screening out the general population, looking for the Joe McMonagals among us.
Well, let's take Joe McMonagle as an example. He was interviewed right in that chair a week ago.
Still warm, actually.
And I know he's your good friend. You've worked with him for decades.
Yes.
And he's an astounding remote viewer, one of several.
Yes.
In your experience, I presume he does show synesthesia ability.
More than an experience, we've done casual testing online by the people who post online how to test for synesthesia. Yes, he's one.
And so your hypothesis here is based on at least a fair amount of preliminary evidence.
Well, him and the other two super psychic stars that I worked with for 30 years, each of them pass high levels of synesthesia by online testing. Now, that's not a formal test. If this works, we will bring them into the laboratory and test them more objectively. This is But 3 people who are synesthetes, in fact, you cannot figure out how the world works with only 3 people.
Now, I know that psychophysicists and psychologists have been studying synesthesia for a long time.
Absolutely.
Is there other data that suggests that this is conducive to precognition?
None.
Okay.
Only that our 3 superstars seem to have it.
Mm-hmm.
So that's one aspect. Another one is it screens out 96% of the population at large.
Yeah, which you want to do.
Which we want to do.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so once that connection has been made into the normal brain system somehow by a synesthetic connection to the other tissue,
yes,
we are guessing or hypothesizing that data is handled exactly the way other forms of input are handled.
Mm-hmm.
And why do we think that? Because people have been looking in parapsychology, as you know, for psychological correlates. And they've been looking for brain correlates to ESP.
Yes.
And while they find some here and they find some there, they go away and they come back again, there have been no stable correlations between the psychology and central nervous system data.
Which, as we discussed in a previous interview, that would be comparable to a lot of other neurophysiological, psychophysiological
Exactly.
data. It shifts around.
Exactly. So what that means is, if that's true,
Mm-hmm.
searching in the brain for signatures of who's psychic and who isn't is almost doomed to failure at the outset unless you can have neurophysiological evidence of a transducer or a psychic retina. Because the rest of it will look like normal processing.
Mm-hmm.
And how do you separate normal processing from psychic processing? It's the same neural tissue doing the same stuff it does, leading it to a cognition that you have. Oh, I know what happened. The coin they're flipping in downtown Las Vegas tomorrow is going to land heads.
Mm-hmm. Now, the brain itself seems to have a wonderful and amazing ability to learn to decode any kind of sensory input information that's coming in from any modality.
Well, it is a remarkable thing we have between our ears that evolution handed us.
Yeah.
You bet.
Mm-hmm.
Now, one of the attractive parts of this model is really twofold.
Mm-hmm.
One is, if we're going to have some precognition of a coin flipping tomorrow in downtown Las Vegas, and we have to now know how it's going to land today, how that information gets from there then to here now is only a physics problem. It doesn't depend upon me. It doesn't matter whether I've fought with my spouse or I'm hungry. It doesn't depend upon any aspects of being human. It's only a physics problem.
It's something related to information theory, to communication theory. There needs to be, I suppose, probably a carrier wave of some sort or another.
Or it could be cosmology kinds of issues that come into play. But the key feature is serious physicists who don't have to worry about what is going on in somebody's head, don't have to worry about what's going on.
They don't have to think about the parapsychological implications. Physicists are already very concerned about the possibilities of retro-causality.
Yes. So that's nice. They don't have to worry about what's going on between our ears.
Yeah.
So the other side of that equation is the neuroscientist, once the information's in the head, which is a big problem because of the psychic retina, but let's just assume it's in there.
Mm-hmm.
Only neuroscientists have to think about that. They don't have to worry about how the information got into the head.
Yeah.
And so that makes allows scientists in these domains to work desperately detailed to figure out what's going on in their own domains, and hopefully they can meet the middle and understand how the transducer works.
Mm-hmm.
So that's one very important aspect of the model. The second one is that, unlike some of the other models available in parapsychology, it is a signal-based model, that somehow the future is signaling the present.
Mm-hmm.
How that happens is a very tough problem to solve, but we assume that that's the case. And what that means is the philosophers that we've been working with say that it does not violate causality. Causality means if I have a pen in my hand and the pen will not drop unless until I open my hands.
Yeah.
And most scientists think that precognition somehow violates that really fundamental principle, which it doesn't.
Well, I know a little bit about causality, not a lot. And the little that I know is that it's extraordinarily complex.
Yes.
There are many, many different kinds of causality. And one kind is called teleology. That is events being caused by a purpose, by a goal, by some idea of what will happen in the future.
Right.
And that itself is a conundrum. Is physicists or scientists in general try to rule out teleology.
They do indeed. Well, there's a common thread in parapsychological research called non-locality.
Yes.
And that's a very attractive thing, and it is brought to bear in understanding how this works. ESP is a non-local functioning.
Mm-hmm.
We disagree with that and say why? It's because all the known sensory systems are all local.
Yeah.
You do not have an experience of a sunset until the photons hit your eyes from the beach. And we are proposing that those psychic photons, if you will, come across backward in time and are sitting right here, and they get into your psychic retina, whatever that turns out to be, and then you have an experience. So I like the parallel. I'm lazy. If I don't have to invent anything new, this is a good way to start. It might be wrong, in which case we rethink the whole problem.
Well, I suppose it's fair for our viewers to understand that the way you, as a scientist, are approaching these issues is to try and stick as closely as possible to conventional scientific modalities, to materialism, to physicalism, to what we know about the nervous system, and start from there rather than, as others might be inclined to do, start from metaphysical hypotheses that are more on the fringes of the scientific culture.
Well, it's probably a meme in the literature or an idea that is widely thought of that this stuff is impossible. It would violate all of physics. We'd have to rewrite stuff. When we're looking in our physics domain as potential arguments of how that might work, we are taking the information from mainstream physics journals. We have not invented anything new. It might not be right, but we don't have to yet invent something new in the physics domain.
And so as far as you're concerned, extrasensory perception, even precognition, is bound to be consistent with mainstream physics.
Yes, I think just physics, physiology, and psychology eventually will help us understand how it all works.
So, in a sense, parapsychology, if it's successful, will put itself out of business.
I hope so, because we parapsychologists are struggling for money, and we're jacks of all trades and masters of none. We need to have some really experts, physics people and neuroscientists, to help us along this path.
Now, the notion of a psychic retina for precognition is an intriguing one, because if information is coming to us, originating in either an actual or a probable future, somehow it has to be registered.
Yes.
And at some point there has to be, I guess, an interface between that information and our nervous system.
That's a good way to think about it. Look, if we didn't have an interface into our nervous system, we wouldn't have that experience to begin with. We wouldn't be sitting here talking about it. So almost by observation, what are called self-evident observation, there must be an interface somewhere. If you were assuming the information is coming here. If you like non-local, maybe you don't need an interface. So that's an attractive idea of the non-local hypothesis. I'm happy to adopt that when the local hypothesis fails.
But the interface could be anywhere in the body.
It might be, but we're going to start in the brain and have a look. Because that interface for all the other sensory things are, for the most part, in fact, I think exclusively in the brain.
Now, there are things that we know about the way the brain processes a lot of other sensory data. And as I understand it, one of the main things that the brain does is it filters out information that we would, our conscious mind would be overloaded if we were to hear every sound and to see every shape and color that passes in front of our visual field.
Well, it's even worse than that. If you and I go to a crowded, noisy restaurant, we sort of filter out all the background hum and can have a nice conversation. So if we as human beings have access to every piece of information in the future forever across all space and time, and we were aware of that all the time, we would go crazy, I think. Yeah. So there's something that is limiting what it is we experience. Mm-hmm. There's a good guess about it, and that is, when we do an experiment, I say, Jeffrey, what we'd like you to do is this, and that's called a task. I give you a task, and that sort of opens that door a little bit, mm-hmm. and then when the whole experiment's finished, it sort of closes the door, and you give the information in that kind of metaphorical door.
When I received the task from you, if I were a remote viewer or a recipient, I set my mental intention
and opens the door
on that task. Yeah. And somehow mental intention in and of itself enables me in a successful remote viewing to narrow down all the possible targets that might be available to me mm-hmm. to the particular one that is related to the task.
We think so.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And how do you think that process works?
Well, it's more complicated in a sense because you have two pictures, one of which is the real answer and the other one is the control. You, in principle, have access to both of those. Mm-hmm. And that's still a mystery. Yeah. I don't know how to account for that in this model as we move forward.
Okay.
We're only looking, we're lazy. Yeah. We say there's only one thing in the future, and that's propagating backward in time, and we as humans have access. I'd like to understand that process. Mm-hmm. We're not going to solve all the mysteries of parapsychology in one model.
Okay, but it's fair to say then that if there is a interface mm-hmm. between our nervous system and psi-mediated information, that interface may be receiving information from everywhere in time and space simultaneously. Exactly. And the act of setting an intention reduces what the mind-brain processor is willing to accept.
I think you need to write the introduction to our model for us. That's really a beautiful description of what we believe is going on.
Yeah. Well, that right there is a great, it's both a mystery and a wondrous thing that the brain can do that.
Well, I like the term, and I'm surprised I never thought of it either, as an interface. I'm a computer guy. I should know something about interfaces mm-hmm. rather than a transducer. That is mm-hmm. a lovely term, and if you don't mind, I'll steal it from you and not give you any credit whatsoever. Of course, I'll give you credit.
You're welcome to.
Thank you.
I'm happy to play a tiny little role in your work because I think your work is very important.
Thank you.
You've done more than almost anybody I know in the field of parapsychology to bring it into the mainstream.
Well, what we try to do is listen to as many people as we can and we get information. And I was joking about not giving you credit for it. You'll get it. It'll be your fault.
A footnote.
Footnote. That's good because it's fantastic.
So let's go back for a moment to the other part of the model, mm-hmm. The physics
domain
portion of it, that somehow there is an information channel coming from actual or probable future events.
That's what we think, yes.
Now,
how does that work, you're asking me?
Well, I physicists I know are speculating about it.
Absolutely.
At this point, and the way I understand it is that at the quantum domain, the idea that events can reverse backwards and forwards in time is well accepted.
Well, that leads us to an idea called entropy, which mm-hmm. will be another lengthy talk we'll have at one of the future times.
We will explore that in more depth, but let's cover it briefly if we can.
Okay. In physics today, oddly enough, not in parapsychology, but in physics, people are worrying about cosmology and information transfer. And right now, it looks like in the physics literature, entropy, which is a measure of chaos. Mm-hmm. You take an ice cube, all the little atoms in there all lined up in a beautiful crystal, and you put it out in the sun, it melts. What happens is the atoms get more chaotic, mm-hmm. so that's an increase of chaos, or entropy it's called. That's been around for 100 years, that idea. Mm-hmm. And now the cosmologists are saying, that might even be more important than gravity. They talk about an entropic force rather than gravity force. Mm-hmm. And that's instrumental in what we think, how this stuff works. Because if you have a force, you then have an energy carrier, and we need some way to getting the information from the future on energy. Why? There's no known examples in all of physics yet where you can get information, whether you hear it or smell it or what have you, where there is not at least some way of carrying that information, assuming that you can actually use the information.
Right.
Yeah.
So the idea is that the arrow of time is related to the fact that entropy increases over time.
Yes, exactly right. Thank you. Because it then tells you, well, I'm getting a little ahead of the game here.
Yeah.
That's a teaser for the next lecture.
Yeah. Yeah, well, we will explore the nature of entropy in another conversation, but it's important at least to establish right now that a model of precognition is going to need to address that.
Absolutely, and frankly, it's the more difficult one compared to the neuroscience one. And hopefully some smart physics theorists will join us in that adventure, and it's an amazing adventure.
But let me ask you this question. The very idea of retro-causation, a causal chain of connection coming from the future into the present. Number one, many physicists are looking at it. There have been conferences of physicists just on that subject.
Just last week, the American Association for the Advancement of Science hosted a series of symposia in San Diego, the University of San Diego, and one of those symposium was quantum retrocausation, mainstream physics people talking about this very problem.
But at the same time, I should think there are some physicists who think that's going too far, that they're not ready to accept that.
Well, they don't. With the main part of retrocausation has nothing to do with parapsychology.
Yeah,
they're just saying, is it possible some future event can influence the present? That's the theoretical physics argument. They all agree they have no data, and we go, oh, we've got some data. It's called precognition, and their heads explode.
I see. I see. So physicists are looking at it simply in terms of the theoretical possibilities.
Exactly.
Oh, okay. Well, Ed May, obviously we're touching a very deep subject, and we're just scratching the surface right now, but it's wonderful to scratch.
Indeed. So we hope we solve that itch one of these days.
Yeah, thank you so much for helping me to scratch that itch.
Thank you, Jeffrey. It's always my pleasure.
And thank you for being with us.
Book 3 in the new Thinking Aloud dialogue series is UFOs and UAP, Are We Really Alone? Now available on Amazon.
You can now download a free PDF copy of issue 7 of the New Thinking Aloud magazine, or order a beautiful printed copy.